The day I found out my parents had sold my recording studio, I was standing in the parking lot of a grocery store holding a bag of oranges. My phone buzzed. It was a forwarded email. The subject line said, "Congratulations on the new acquisition." I did not know what acquisition they meant. Then I saw my studio's address in the body of the email listed as a completed business asset transfer. My studio. The one I had spent 4 years building from a rented storage room with bad acoustics and a second-hand soundboard. The one I had given up vacations, relationships, and sleep for. The one my parents had been asking me to let Marcus use for a little while for the past 6 months. I stood there in that parking lot, oranges in my hands, reading an email that told me my life's work had just changed hands. And the worst part was not that they had done it. The worst part was what they had left out of the paperwork. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something real. If the people you trusted most with your biggest dream quietly moved pieces of it without telling you the whole truth, what would you do first? Would you confront them right away, or would you go quiet and gather every single fact before you said a word? Think about that, because the answer Lousia chose changed everything. My name is Lousia, and I want to start by telling you something about the kind of person I used to be because it matters for everything that comes after. I was the daughter who never asked for much. I did not demand birthday parties or expensive gifts. I did not create scenes at the dinner table. I did not call home every week to complain about my life. I was the one who showed up, handled things, and quietly kept moving. I thought that was strength. I thought being low maintenance and dependable was something to be proud of. I did not realize until much later that it was also the thing that made it easiest for my family to take from me without feeling like they were doing anything wrong. I grew up in a medium-sized city in the Midwest with my parents, my older brother Marcus, and a grandmother who lived with us until I was 12. My father worked in logistics. My mother managed the front office of a dental practice. We were not rich, but we were not struggling either. We were the kind of family that looked fine from the outside and had complicated feelings about everything on the inside. Marcus was 4 years older than me, and he was always the one with the big ideas. He talked fast, smiled easily, and had a way of making every room feel like it was already celebrating him before he had done anything worth celebrating. People loved Marcus. They always had. He had charisma, and charisma is powerful when you are young and still figuring out who you are. I was quieter. I was the one who read books, listened to music obsessively, and spent hours in my room trying to understand why certain songs made my chest feel tight. By the time I was 15, I knew I wanted to work in sound, not perform, produce. I wanted to be the person behind the glass, the one who shaped what you heard before you heard it. I told my parents this, and they nodded the way parents nod when they think a child is going through a phase. Marcus was already talking about entrepreneurship and business degrees, and they were paying much closer attention to that. I did not let their doubts stop me. I took every class I could find. I saved money from babysitting and a part-time job at a coffee shop. I watched tutorial videos late into the night. I taught myself audio engineering through books I ordered online and forums where working professionals were generous enough to answer questions from people like me. By the time I graduated high school, I had a plan, and the plan was specific. I was going to build a recording studio. Not right away. I knew I needed experience first. I moved to a bigger city, got a job at a small post-production company doing basic audio cleanup work, and spent 3 years learning from every senior engineer who would give me time. I saved aggressively. I lived cheaply. I cooked at home, skipped expensive nights out, and put every extra dollar into what I was already calling my studio fund. My coworkers thought I was boring, maybe I was. But I had a number in my head, and I was moving toward it every single month. By the time I was 27, I had enough to lease a commercial space. It was not glamorous. It was a converted storage unit in a light industrial area, approximately 900 square feet with drop ceilings and concrete floors. But the bones were good, the lease was affordable, and the landlord allowed build-out. I spent the next 8 months doing most of the construction myself with the help of two friends who knew carpentry and one sound engineer I had met at a conference who helped me design the acoustic panels and floating floor. I named the studio Clearsound. It was mine in every possible way. My hands had touch. Ed every wall. I opened Clearsound officially when I was 28. The first year was slow. I had a few local musicians come in, a podcast client or two, a corporate narration client who needed voiceover work. The revenue was modest, but it was growing. I worked 12-hour days most weeks. I did sales, scheduling, engineering, and cleaning all by myself for the first 14 months before I could afford to hire part-time help. I did not complain about this to my family. I sent them occasional updates. My mother would text back with a thumbs up. My father would say, "That sounds great, honey." Marcus would occasionally say cool without further comment. By my third year, Clearsound had a reputation in the local music community. I had worked with several independent artists who had gone on to have regional followings. I had landed a contract with a regional advertising firm that needed regular audio production. I had upgraded the main recording room with better equipment and added a second smaller booth for voiceover work. My revenue had tripled from year one. I had hired a part-time assistant engineer and a part-time studio coordinator. I was finally, for the first time in my adult life, feeling financially stable and professionally respected. I had built something real, something that worked, something that was mine. That was when Marcus came home. He had spent his late 20s doing various things that never quite worked out. He had started a clothing brand that dissolved after a year. He had done some consulting work for a friend's company. He had tried to launch a fitness app that never got past the idea stage. None of this seemed to dim his confidence. Marcus always had a next idea, and he always described each next idea as the one that was finally going to change everything. When he came home to our parents' house at 32, he told them he had found his real calling. He was going to start a music-focused technology company. He wanted to build a platform for independent artists to upload, distribute, and monetize their music directly, cutting out the middlemen. It was not a bad idea. In fact, it was a reasonable idea. The problem was that Marcus had no actual experience in the music industry. He had enthusiasm and some business school vocabulary and very little else. The first time he called me about it, I was genuinely happy to talk. He asked me questions about how independent artists handled distribution deals, what their pain points were, how studios factored into their revenue. I answered everything honestly because I knew this world and I wanted to help. We had a good conversation. He seemed engaged, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like Marcus and I were connecting as adults. I thought maybe this was the beginning of something better between us. Then he called again a week later and asked if he could use Clearsound as the home base for his company. I did not say yes immediately. I asked what he meant. He explained that he wanted to use the studio space to host meetings with potential investors, to record demo content for the platform, and to film some promotional material. He said it would give his startup a legitimate, professional appearance. He said it would be temporary, just until he raised enough funding to get his own office. I told him I would think about it. I had a full booking calendar and a business to run. I could not simply open my doors to another operation without knowing exactly what that looked like. He called again 3 days later. He said my parents thought it was a great idea. That phrase, my parents thought it was a great idea, settled in my chest in a way I did not immediately understand, but I filed it away. I spoke to my parents that weekend. My mother said Marcus's idea sounded very promising and that family helps family. My father said it would be good for me to have a partner in that space, that running a business alone was hard and having Marcus nearby might take some pressure off me. I noticed that neither of them asked about my booking calendar or my existing clients. They were not asking whether it was convenient for me. They were gently informing me that it was going to happen. I agreed to let Marcus use a portion of the studio for meetings a few evenings per week. I was specific about the terms. He could use the front lobby area and the small lounge. He could not bring people into the control room or the recording booths without my direct approval. He would not touch any of my equipment. He would book through me with at least 48 hours notice. He agreed to everything. For the first month, things were manageable. Marcus came in twice a week with a few people, sat in the lounge, had conversations, and left. I stayed out of their meetings and they stayed out of mine. But by the second month, I started noticing things. Marcus was showing up more often than we had agreed. He was bringing larger groups. Once I came in on a morning when I client sessions scheduled and found 3 people I did not recognize sitting in my control room, looking at my equipment. I asked them politely to move to the lobby. One of them looked at Marcus as if to ask whether they had to. Marcus laughed it off and said, "Of course, my bad." He never apologized directly to me. I had a conversation with Marcus about the boundaries we had agreed on. He said he was sorry and that things had just gotten a little busy with the investor process. He said it would not happen again. He was warm and charming the way Marcus always was when he needed something from you. I believed him, or I wanted to, which is different. By month 3, Marcus had a key to the building. I had not given it to him. I found out when I asked my studio coordinator how Marcus had gone in on a Saturday when I had not scheduled him, and she told me quietly that my father had dropped off a copy of the key 2 weeks earlier and told her my mother had said it was fine. I called my mother. She said they had just made a copy in case of emergencies. She said I was being sensitive. I said that Clearsound was my business and that no one made copies of my keys without asking me first. She went quiet and then said that Marcus was working very hard on something important and that I should be supportive. I told her I had been supportive and that support did not mean unlimited access with no communication. She said she hoped I was not going to make this into something. I was not making it into something, it was already something. Over the next 2 months, I documented everything. I wrote down every time Marcus came in outside of agreed hours. I wrote down every time equipment was moved or adjusted without my permission. I wrote down every client conversation that was disrupted because Marcus's meetings ran long into the evening and clients felt uncomfortable walking through a room full of strangers. I wrote down every time my studio coordinator seemed uncertain about who had authority over the space. I had a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer, and I filled it steadily without saying much to anyone. Marcus's investor meetings were getting bigger. He was now bringing in people who introduced themselves with titles like venture associate and angel investor. He had started telling these people stories about Clearsound that were not accurate. My coordinator told me she had overheard him describe the studio as a collaborative creative incubator that his team had developed. She said she had not known whether to correct him. I told her she had done nothing wrong. I told her to start keeping a brief log of anything Marcus told visitors about the studio. Then came the evening of the dinners. My parents invited me over for a Sunday dinner in November. It was a normal thing, or it seemed like one. I brought a salad and a bottle of sparkling water. Marcus was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with a folder of papers in front of him. He was dressed well, better than usual, and he had the particular energy he always had before he announced something he expected people to celebrate. We sat down to eat. My mother had made her roasted chicken, and the conversation was pleasant for about 20 minutes. Then my father cleared his throat and said that Marcus had some exciting news to share with the family. Marcus smiled and said that the startup was moving into its next phase. He said he had a serious investor group interested in committing real money, a number that made my mother gasp softly, and that they were prepared to close the deal within 60 days. He said the investor group had looked at everything, and they were particularly impressed by the studio infrastructure that Marcus's team had access to. I put down my fork. I asked Marcus what exactly he had told the investor group about the studio infrastructure. He said he had told them that Clearsound was a key operational asset of the company. I said slowly that Clearsound was my business and not part of his company. There was a silence at the table. My father said that they had wanted to talk to me about that. He and my mother exchanged a look. My mother reached over and touched my hand. She said they knew this was going to be a big conversation, but that it was an exciting opportunity. My father said that in order for Marcus to close the investor deal, Clearsound needed to be officially listed as a company asset. He said they had done some research and that the process could be handled relatively simply if I agreed to a transfer arrangement. I asked what kind of transfer arrangement. My father said that technically the studio building and equipment would need to be listed under Marcus's company name for the investor agreement. He said I would still be involved. He said Marcus needed me, he really did, and that I would have a role in the company. He said this was a chance for our whole family to benefit from something big. I asked whose name was current. Lie on the lease agreement for Clearsound. My father said mine. I asked whose name was on the business license. My father said mine. I asked whose name was on the equipment financing agreements and the liability insurance. He said mine. I said then nothing has been transferred anywhere yet. My mother said not officially, no. She said they had just wanted to talk to me about it first. I sat very still. I had eaten about half my chicken and I remember thinking that it had gone cold. I looked at Marcus. He was watching me with an expression I can only describe as careful. He was waiting to see which version of Lousia he was dealing with, the Lousia who kept the peace or a different one. I told them I needed time to think. My mother said, of course, sweetheart, take all the time you need. My father said the investor timeline was about 60 days, so they just wanted to make sure we moved with enough room to be comfortable. I said I understood. I drove home in complete silence with the radio off. That night I did not sleep well, but I did not panic either. I sat at my kitchen table and I made a list. I listed everything I knew, everything I did not yet know, and everything I needed to find out before I said another word to my family about Clearsound. At the top of the list, I wrote the name of a business attorney a friend had recommended to me 18 months ago. I had her card somewhere in my filing cabinet. I found it at midnight and I sent her an email. She called me 2 days later. I told her everything. She asked several specific questions and then asked me to bring her my lease agreement, my business license, all equipment financing documents, my original studio build-out receipts, and any correspondence related to my brother's use of the space. I brought her everything I had, including my small notebook of documented incidents, and the email I had found in the parking lot a few days after that Sunday dinner, the forwarded email about a completed business asset transfer, which had arrived in my inbox through a chain I was not supposed to be part of. My attorney read through everything carefully, then she told me something that made my hands go cold and calm at the same time. She said that someone she could not yet determine who without more information had apparently filed some preliminary paperwork suggesting Clearsound was being incorporated into Marcus's company as a contributed asset. The filing was not complete. It had not been fully executed because the final step required my signature on a lease assignment agreement. But it was real, someone had started the process without telling me. She said the good news was that nothing had legally transferred. My name was still on everything that mattered: the lease, the license, the insurance, the equipment loans. No one could legally take Clearsound from me without my signature, and I had not signed anything. She said the paperwork that had been started was aggressive but not yet binding. She said we needed to act clearly and promptly to make sure it stayed that way. I asked her what clearly and promptly looked like. She said it started with a formal letter. Over the next 2 weeks, my attorney drafted a letter addressed to my parents, to Marcus, and to the investor group that Marcus had been presenting to. The letter stated clearly that Clearsound was my sole-owned business, that I was the leaseholder, license holder, and owner of all equipment on the premises, and that no transfer of ownership, partial or complete, had been authorized by me in any form. It stated that any representations made to investors or third parties suggesting otherwise were inaccurate, and that I expected all such representations to be corrected within 10 business days. It stated that any further use of my studio name, address, or physical space in relation to Marcus's company would be considered unauthorized and would be treated accordingly. My attorney sent the letter by certified mail and by email to all parties. The response was fast and loud. Marcus called me within 2 hours of receiving the letter. He was not warm this time. He said I was destroying his deal. He said I was doing this out of jealousy. He said he could not believe I was going to let a paperwork technicality blow up something that was going to benefit the whole family. I listened to him speak for about 4 minutes without interrupting. Then I told him that a business I had built from nothing over 4 years was not a paperwork technicality. I told him if he had come to me honestly 6 months ago and said he wanted to build something together with Clearsound at the center, I would have listened. What he had done instead was use the studio without proper permission, misrepresent it to investors, and allow my parents to start paperwork transferring my business without my knowledge or consent. I said the letter was not a personal attack. It was a correction of facts. Then I ended the call. My mother called 20M. Minutes later, she was crying or close to it. She said she did not understand why I was doing this. She said Marcus had worked so hard and this investor deal was going to change everything for him. She said my father and she had thought I would be happy to be part of something bigger. I asked her gently when exactly she had planned to tell me about the preliminary paperwork that had been filed. There was a long pause. She said they had meant to talk to me about it before it went any further. I asked if the Sunday dinner had been that conversation. She said they had wanted to give me time to get used to the idea first. I said that filing paperwork before asking the owner for permission was not giving someone time. It was assuming the answer was yes before the question was asked. She did not have a response to that. My father called that evening. He was calmer than Marcus but sharper than my mother. He said he understood I was upset but that I needed to look at the bigger picture. He said Marcus's company could eventually be worth a great deal and that as a family we needed to think about long-term benefit. He said I was being short-sighted. I asked him if he would have called Clearsound short-sighted 4 years ago when I was pouring my savings into concrete floors and acoustic panels. He went quiet. I asked if he would have called it short-sighted 3 years ago when I was working 12-hour days alone trying to make the business survive. He was still quiet. I said that Clearsound was not a family asset waiting to be allocated. It was something I had built specifically because no one in the family had offered to help me build it. I said that did not make me angry, it was just true. But the fact that I had built it alone meant it was mine alone. My father said he hoped I would reconsider. I said I hoped he would reflect on how this had been handled. We ended the call politely, but something had shifted. We both knew it. Now let me tell you about the investor group, because that is where things became very interesting. The investor group Marcus had been courting was a small but serious syndicate of regional tech investors, 4 people who pooled funds for early-stage companies in media and entertainment technology. They had a reputation for doing real due diligence before committing anything. Their lead contact was a woman named Renata, who had been in the industry for over 15 years and had seen many pitches that looked better than they were. After receiving my attorney's letter, Renata's team reached out directly to my attorney to clarify the situation. My attorney confirmed everything in writing. Renata then requested a direct call with me. My attorney advised me to take the call with her present. I agreed. On the call, Renata was professional and direct. She said Marcus had presented Clearsound as a core operational asset of his company, a fully equipped recording and production facility that was part of the company's infrastructure and would strengthen the operational credibility of the platform. She said the studio had been a significant factor in their initial interest. She said she had now received information suggesting the studio was not in fact an asset of Marcus's company. She said she needed to understand the situation clearly before her group moved any further. I told her the situation clearly. I told her Clearsound was my business, that I had built it over 4 years, that I held all legal ownership, and that I had granted my brother temporary limited access as a courtesy, not as a business arrangement. I told her that to my knowledge I had not authorized anyone to represent Clearsound as part of his company's assets and that I had not signed any transfer or contribution agreement. Renata listened without interrupting. When I finished, she thanked me and said she appreciated the directness. 3 days later, Marcus called me again. The warmth was entirely gone now. He said the investor group had paused the deal pending clarification. He said I had deliberately sabotaged his business. He said I had gone behind his back to destroy something he had spent 2 years building. I reminded him that I had responded to a letter sent to me by certified mail, which meant the investor group had been informed of the situation by my attorney only after they requested clarification. I had not contacted them unsolicited. I had answered questions honestly when asked. Marcus said that was just legal maneuvering and I knew what I was doing. I said yes. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was protecting my business. That night, Marcus posted something on his social media. It was vague but pointed. He wrote about betrayal from the people you least expect. He wrote about how family could surprise you. He tagged several mutual contacts. Some of my own industry colleagues saw it and reached out to ask if I was okay. I thanked them for checking in and did not say more than was necessary. My parents called me together that weekend and asked if I would come to the house to talk in person. I said yes, but I would be bringing my attorney by phone, available to participate if needed. My father said that felt extreme. I said it felt like appropriate preparation for a conversation that involved legal and financial matters. I went to the house. My parents were in the living room. Marcus was not there, which surprised me. My mother had made tea. We sat down, and my father began by saying that he and my mother wanted to apologize. He said the word carefully, not the way people say it when they mean it immediately, but the way people say it when they have decided it is necessary. He said they should have spoken to me directly before allowing any paperwork to proceed. He said they had gotten caught up in the excitement of Marcus's opportunity, and they had assumed I would want to help without thinking carefully enough about what that meant for me. I sat with that for a moment. I asked my father if he had actually read the preliminary paperwork that had been filed. He said Marcus had handled most of that. I asked if either of them had reviewed what was being signed or filed on my behalf or in relation to my business. My mother said they had trusted Marcus to handle the details. I asked if it had occurred to either of them that Marcus handling the details of my business was precisely the problem. There was a long quiet. My father said yes. He said looking back it was not right. My mother said they had not been thinking clearly and that they were sorry. These were real words. I could hear something genuine underneath them, not just necessity, but I also knew that apologies exist in the moment they are said and patterns exist across years. The pattern I was looking at was one in which my parents had consistently treated Marcus's ambitions as the family's primary project and my work as something that could flex around his needs. I told them I accepted their apology, I told them I meant that, and then I told them what was going to happen next. I said Clearsound was going to remain entirely mine. I was not going to transfer any portion of it listed as anyone else's asset or incorporate it into any other company. I said Marcus was welcome to find a different studio to use for his investor meetings, and I hoped he would find one. I said I bore him no personal ill will. I wanted his company to succeed on accurate terms, but those terms could not include my property. My father asked if there was any scenario in which I would be open to a formal partnership arrangement, one that compensated me fairly and gave me equity in Marcus's company in exchange for the studio's official involvement. I paused on that question. It was a legitimate one. I told my father that if Marcus had come to me 18 months ago with that exact proposal, a real one with real numbers and real legal structure and real honesty, I would have seriously considered it. But that was not what had happened. What had happened was that my studio had been slowly walked into his company's pitch materials while I was running my business inside it, and then I had been invited to a family dinner to be told to sign over what was already being used. The trust required for a real partnership had been broken by the process. My father nodded slowly. My mother was crying quietly into her tea. I told her it was okay. I told her I was not leaving the family. I was protecting what I had built. Those were not the same thing. I drove home that evening with the windows down even though it was cold. I needed the air. Now I need to tell you what happened with the investor group, because Renata did something I was not expecting. About 3 weeks after the initial letter had been sent and the investor group had paused the deal, Renata contacted my attorney again. She said her group had completed their review of the situation and had made a decision about Marcus's company. She said they were not going to proceed with the deal as originally structured. She said the misrepresentation of Clearsound as a company asset was disqualifying for their group, not because they were being punitive, but because accurate representation of assets was a fundamental requirement of any deal they made. An investor group that closes on a company believing it owns a recording studio and then discovers after closing that it does not is not a group that made a good investment decision. Renata said she respected Marcus's product concept, but that the foundation of the pitch had been inaccurate, and they could not work with that. She also said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that the studio itself, meaning Clearsound, had genuinely impressed her team when they reviewed it. She said the operational history, the client base, the revenue growth, and the reputation in the local music community were notable for a business of its age and size. She said she would be interested in a separate conversation if I were ever open to investment in Clearsound itself, not as part of anyone else's venture but on its own merits. I told my attorney to tell Renata I would be happy to have that conversation. Marcus found out about the investor group's decision 2 days before I found out about Renata's interest in Clearsound. He texted me a single line that said, "I hope you're satisfied." I did not respond. There was nothing honest I could say that would have helped the situation, and I had decided some time ago that I was not in the business of managing Marcus's feelings about consequences he had created. My parents found out about Renata's interest through my attorney's communications, which they were copied on because they had been party to the original situation. My mother called me and said she was glad something good was coming out of all of this. I appreciated that she said it. My father called and asked if this meant I was thinking about expanding Clearsound. I told him yes, I was exploring it carefully. He said that sounded wise. It was a quiet conversation, shorter than usual. Something had changed in how we spoke, not coldly but carefully. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something about what those weeks felt like from the inside, because I think it matters for understanding what came after. It was not triumphant, it did not feel like winning a game. It felt like walking through a room with the lights finally on and seeing clearly where all the furniture was after months of navigating in the dark and bumping into things and convincing yourself the darkness was normal. I was not angry in the sharp, burning way I had been in the parking lot with the oranges. I was something quieter than that. I was resolved. I knew what Clearsound was. I knew what I had done to build it. I knew that no one in my family had helped me and that they had still felt entitled to its benefits when those benefits became visible enough to be worth wanting. And I knew that the version of Lousia who would have said yes at that Sunday dinner just to keep the peace was not someone I could be anymore. Keeping the peace is only worth something if peace is actually what exists. What I had been keeping was a performance of peace over a foundation that had quietly been eroding for years. Let me tell you about the months that followed. My meeting with Renata happened about 6 weeks after everything had settled enough for me to think clearly. We met in person at a coffee shop near my studio. Renata was a composed, specific woman in her mid-40s who had a habit of pausing before she answered questions, not because she was uncertain, but because she was making sure she said exactly what she meant. I liked that quality. It reminded me of how I tried to operate. She said her group was interested in a minority investment in Clearsound, meaning they would put in capital in exchange for a share of ownership, but I would retain majority control and the daily operation would remain entirely mine. She said they were interested in helping me expand into a second location and develop a proprietary production training program for emerging artists. She said they had looked at my revenue trajectory and believed I had built something with real growth potential that had been underutilized because I had been running everything alone. I asked her what had drawn her group to Clearsound specifically. She said, without any particular drama, that the moment she had learned the studio was owned and operated by a single person who had built it from a storage unit with her own money and her own hands, and had grown it into a profitable business with a strong local reputation in under 5 years, she had found it significantly more impressive than anything Marcus had shown them. She said businesses that are built by real people with real money and real work are easier to trust than businesses built on borrowed credibility. I sat with that for a few seconds, then I said thank you. We went on to have a 2-hour conversation about Clearsound, its history, its client base, its current revenue model, its operational structure, and my long-term vision for what it could become. By the end of the meeting, I had not agreed to anything, but I had told Renata I was seriously interested and would have my attorney review any formal proposal her group put together. The formal proposal came 4 weeks later. It was detailed and fair. My attorney reviewed it line by line. We negotiated several terms over the following 2 weeks. The final agreement gave Renata's group a 20% minority stake in Clearsound in exchange for a capital injection that would allow me to lease a second studio space, purchase new equipment, hire 2 full-time engineers, and launch a 6-month emerging artist residency program. I signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning in my attorney's office. Then I drove to Clearsound and sat in the control room for a while by myself. The room smelled the same way it always had, like acoustic foam and a little bit of coffee. I put on one of the first tracks I had ever mixed in that space, an independent singer-songwriter's EP that she had recorded on a budget so small it barely covered the session hours. It had turned out beautifully. I remembered how proud I had been of the mix. I sat there and listened to it and thought about all the hours between that session and this morning, and something inside me settled into a place it had not been in a very long time. Now let me tell you what happened with Marcus, because the story does not end with the investment deal. About a month after I signed with Renata's group, Marcus reached out. It was a text message, not a phone call, which told me something about where his confidence level was. He said he wanted to talk. He said things had gotten out of hand and he thought we should clear the air as siblings. I told him I was open to talking. We met at a neutral location, a diner midway between our respective neighborhoods. Marcus looked tired. He had aged a little in the months since all of this had happened, or maybe I was just seeing him without the performance for the first time in a long time. He ordered coffee and said that he had been thinking about everything and that he was sorry for how it had gone. He said he had made assumptions about what I would agree to and that he had let the pressure of the investor timeline push him into moving faster than was honest. He said he should have come to me first, before anything was filed, before any investor was told anything about the studio. I listened to him, I did not interrupt. When he finished, I told him I appreciated him saying that, then I told him something that I had been thinking about for a while. I said that the part that had hurt most was not the paperwork or the investor situation. Those things had been problems I could solve with legal help and documentation. The part that had hurt was older than that. It was the years of watching my work be treated as flexible and his ambitions be treated as central. It was my parents making a copy of my key without asking me. It was the way he had described Clearsound to investors without once mentioning my name. It was the feeling that my contribution was always going to be assumed rather than requested. Marcus was quiet for a while, then he said he did not have a good answer for that. He said he thought he had always assumed I would be fine because I always seemed fine. I told him that seeming fine and being fine were two very different things and that for a long time I had worked very hard at seeming fine because I did not know what the alternative was. He said he understood. I do not know if he fully did, but I believed he was trying to. We finished our coffee. We did not hug when we left, but we did not leave as enemies either. He said he hoped Clearsound kept growing. I told him I hoped his company found its footing. I meant both things. Marcus was not a bad person. He was a person who had been allowed to grow in a direction that did not require him to consider what others were carrying. That was not entirely his fault. But it was his responsibility to change, and that part was not mine to manage. My parents continued to be in my life. The relationship was different now, not broken, but renegotiated. My father started calling more regularly, smaller conversations, checking in without an agenda. My mother began asking about Clearsound in specific ways, asking about the clients, about the new space I was looking at, about the residency program. She still sent Marcus money occasionally and talked about his startup with more energy than she talked about my business, but she was making an effort in the direction of me, and I noticed it. I did not need them to suddenly reverse 30 years of habit. I just needed them to include me in the picture with the same genuine interest they had always extended to Marcus. That was a reasonable ask, and slowly, imperfectly, they were beginning to manage it. The second Clearsound location opened 14 months after I signed the investor agreement. It was bigger than the first, a proper commercial studio with 2 large recording rooms, a mixing suite, a vocal isolation booth, and a dedicated production room for the residency program. The opening week was full. I had more session requests than I could immediately accommodate. 3 independent artists who had been on my waiting list for months came through that first week, and the sessions went beautifully. On the opening day, Renata and her team came by. My part-time coordinator from the original location, now my full-time studio manager, had set up a small gathering in the lobby. There was good food and several musicians I had worked with over the years. Renata stood near the entrance and looked around the space with the careful, precise expression I had come to recognize as her version of being impressed. My parents came, my F. Ather shook hands with Renata and made conversation with 2 musicians he did not know. My mother walked through the recording room slowly, touching the acoustic panels with her fingertips. At some point, she stopped and turned to look at me with an expression I had not seen from her in a long time, something that looked like it might be the beginning of understanding what I had actually been doing all these years. Marcus did not come to the opening. I had not expected him to. Maybe someday he would walk through the door and that would mean something, or maybe not. Either way, Clearsound's second location did not need his presence to be real. What I know now, standing on this side of everything, is something I want to say clearly because I think it matters. The hardest part of all of it was not the legal situation. Paperwork is solvable, attorneys are findable, documents are correctable. The hardest part was the moment in the parking lot with the oranges when I held a forwarded email and understood that the people who were supposed to celebrate what I had built had instead quietly begun to move it towards someone else's name. That moment was not about the studio. That moment was about the specific pain of being the one who does the invisible work and finding out that invisible work is apparently transferable once it becomes visible enough to want. I had spent years being the quiet one, the capable one, the one who figured things out without making a fuss. I had believed that if I built something real on honest effort and real money and genuine craft, people would see it for what it was. And some people did. Renata saw it immediately, my clients saw it, my engineers saw it, the musicians who had recorded with me and come back saw it. My family had needed a little longer, and that was painful, but it was not the end of the story. It was not even close to the end of the story. The residency program launched 8 months after the second location opened. 6 emerging artists were selected through an application process my studio manager and I designed together. They received 50 hours of studio time, mentorship sessions with working engineers, and a finished 4-track EP at the end of the residency. The first cohort were all between the ages of 19 and 23. 2 of them had never been inside a professional recording studio before. Watching them walk into the control room for the first time and see the mixing board and the soundproofed glass, and the reflection of their own work taking shape through the monitors, was one of the best things I have ever been part of. One of those artists, a 21-year-old from our city who wrote about her immigrant parents' journey through folk-influenced indie songs, uploaded her EP to streaming platforms 6 weeks after her residency ended. Within a month, it had received attention from 2 music blogs with national readership. Within 3 months, she had been approached by a regional booking agency. She came back to Clearsound to record her follow-up project, and she paid in full at our standard rates because she said it was important to her to come back as a client and not just as a success story. I appreciated that more than I told her. Renata's group came back to me a year into the partnership with a proposal to discuss a third location. I told them I needed at least 18 months to stabilize what we had before I thought about growing again. Renata nodded and said that was exactly the right answer. I took that as a compliment. I want to tell you about one more moment before I bring this to a close, because I think it captures something true. About 2 years after the investor letter had been sent, Marcus and I were both at a family gathering for my grandmother's 80th birthday. It was a large occasion at my parents' house, cousins and aunts, and the particular organized chaos of an extended family that does not often gather together. Marcus and I were in the kitchen at one point, just the two of us, standing near the counter while someone in the other room was making a toast. He told me his company was still going. He had restructured it, made it smaller and more focused, found 2 partners who were putting in actual work alongside him. He said it was not the big investor deal he had originally imagined, but it was real and it was moving. I told him that sounded good. He asked how the second Clearsound location was doing. I told him it had just crossed a revenue milestone I had set for it internally, and that the residency program's second cohort was halfway through their sessions. He said that was impressive. I told him thank you. Then he said something that I did not expect. He said that he had talked to some people in the music industry who knew about Clearsound and that my name came up with genuine respect. He said they described me as someone who had built something serious, not someone who had backed into a business by accident. He said he ha. D realized, a little late, that he had never really seen what I was building while I was building it, and that he was sorry for that too. I looked at him for a moment. My brother, 4 years older, still with that quality of presence that made rooms pay attention to him, standing in our mother's kitchen, being honest, maybe for the first time in a long time, about what he had missed. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and I meant it, not because it fixed everything, not because it erased the paperwork or the Sunday dinner or the email about the completed acquisition, but because it was true and it was said without anyone asking him to say it, which meant it came from somewhere real. That is the version of Marcus I had always hoped existed underneath the performance. We went back to the party. Someone had brought a cake. My grandmother sat at the center of the room in her best dress and received all of us with the particular warmth that very old people carry when they have decided to only spend their energy on what matters. At some point, she took my hand and said that I looked like I was doing well. I told her I was. She said she could tell because I looked like someone who knew where she stood. I thought about that for a long time afterward, knowing where you stand. I did not always know where I stood. There had been years when I was not sure if I was a daughter, a convenience, a resource, or a real person with real claims on the things I had built. The answer to that question turned out not to come from my family deciding to see me differently. It came from me deciding to stop accepting invisibility as the price of belonging. Clearsound was mine because I built it. It stayed mine because I said so clearly and did not apologize for it. And everything good that came after, the investment, the second location, the residency, the artists, the slow and imperfect repair of family relationships, all of it was only possible because I had stood in a parking lot holding oranges and made a decision to stop looking away. The recording studio I built from a storage unit is now, 5 years after I opened it and 2 years after I almost lost it, the thing I am most proud of in my life, not because of what it earns, not because of what it looks like, because of what it cost me and what I chose to do when someone tried to take it. When you build something real, protect it like it is real, because people who did not help you build it will still want to benefit from it when it becomes something worth having. That is not always malice. Sometimes it is just human nature, but it is something you have to see clearly, and seeing it clearly is your right, not your burden. Not your apology. Your right. Before you move on, I want to ask you something that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. Have you ever built something quietly with your own effort and your own sacrifice, and then watched someone close to you try to fold it into their story as if they had always been part of it? And if so, what did you do? Did you hold your ground, or did you give a little just to keep the peace? I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below, because Lousia's story is not as rare as it should be, and the people who have lived something like it deserve to say so.